And unfortunately, we are still missing two speakers. Probably they are still looking for coffee or for something else outside. I think Alice and Heather certainly will join us soon. I also welcome the remote participants. We have remote participation, and I would encourage the moderators for remote participation to give us a signal if some people from remote participation will ask a question or will make an intervention. You know, and in this session now, so we have to go one step forward. We had very exciting two sessions in the morning where we discussed the various elements and dimensions and understandings of what enhanced cooperation is. And I think this session now should already take some conclusions and to go, you know, one step further and to say, okay, what has to be done now? What are the next steps that we move forward? In my understanding, enhanced cooperation had a beginning. It was in the Tunis commitment, in the Tunis agenda, but it has no end. It's an ongoing process. So that means we will never reach a moment where we said, now we have a situation where enhanced cooperation is implemented. So in an academic meeting a couple of years ago, and Avri and Bernadette and also Teresa were involved, we defined enhanced cooperation. It was more an academic definition as enhanced communication, coordination and collaboration, and we had even a formula for it. It was EC3, so because three C's, and I think this is more or less this definition, you know, has a certain meaning, and I realized in the morning sessions that this is indeed that's going on. The first thing we have to do is to enhance communication, that we know what the others are doing, and without this knowledge, without informed participation, we will reach no progress. That means to transfer the knowledge, you know, to communicate to each other among the various groups and stakeholders and governmental and non-governmental participants is the first step. Then the next step is the coordination. That means you have to avoid the duplication of activities. You know, the wonderful new word we have created, this was not in the Tunis agenda, but it's now in our language, is the Internet governance ecosystem. There is no single body which takes care of the Internet. We have an ecosystem with dozens, probably hundreds of different or organizations dealing with different aspects. And insofar, coordination is important so that we avoid that two organizations are doing the same things and end up in a conflict or in a competition where competition is not needed. So that means a certain type of coordination as the basis of communication is a right step in the right direction. And the next thing is then the formal collaboration. That means where we identify fields where we can collaborate to do things together. You do things on the right side, I do things on the left side, and together we are stronger. So that means the Internet is a network of networks. Nobody controls everything, and every individual party has to fulfill its responsibilities on the place where it is. So the regional Internet registries have to take care of the numbers. You know, the GNSO has to be, or the ICANN has to take care on the generic top-level domains. UNESCO, we heard this morning, you know, for IDNs and language tables. And you can go around, you know, a lot of other organizations, they have their responsibilities and has to collaborate together. So this is more or less the big picture we have discussed this morning. And now in this session, we should say, okay, what would be the next step? And as I said, the enhanced cooperation had a beginning, but no end. It's a process where we improve year by year. So my question to the panelists here, and I will introduce them in a minute, is, you know, what would be the next step where we have to improve, enhance, change something in the coming year? From now, 2012, to the IGF in Indonesia in 2013. Very concrete and a very short and brief answer. So on the panel we have, if the two ladies are arrived, then we have a very gender imbalanced panel, because we have 6 women and only 2 men on the panel, and which is fantastic. And But so far only 4 women have arrived. You know, this is Teresa Swinehart, Vice President von Verizon. This is Bernadette Lewis. She's with the Caribbean Telecommunication Union. This is Avri Doria. She represents the civil society and is also Vice President of the new project .gay. And she was a former GNSO chair in ICANN. And we have Carolina Aguirre. She is the manager for this TLD organization of CCTLDs in Latin America and is writing her doctoral thesis in Buenos Aires. And Paul Wilson, well known, is from the APNIC, the Asian Pacific Regional Internet Registry. So we have missing the government, so that Heather is hopefully still coming, and Alice also representing the government, so that means a little bit stakeholder imbalance also on this panel. But let me start by asking Avri, you know, what in your eyes, you know, should be the next steps in enhancing communication, coordination and collaboration?
Okay, thank you, Wolfgang. I think, though, before I actually get to that, I'm actually stepping back a little because I think I need to step back a little to get to where I think we need to be going. In this morning's conversation, there was quoting of Tunis Agenda 69 in its reference to enhanced cooperation, 68 and 69. What was neglected and what was alluded to by Marcus and by Fiona towards the end of the section is how enhanced cooperation in the Tunis Agenda was actually set inside another context. So if people go back and read the Tunis Agenda, they'll read that 67 starts with the convening of a multi-stakeholder policy dialogue. The 68 then attends. So the dialogue starts before we get to the enhanced cooperation in 68 and 69, which demands the equal role for governments, goes on to recognize in 69 enhanced cooperation in the future with governments on an equal footing. 70 calls for organizations to start working together, the cooperation that we're talking about. 71 asks the UN to start a process. 72 defines a forum wherein that process can unfold. 73 talks about the IGF and what it will do. So when you speak about enhanced cooperation as something in itself, that's a reality that didn't really come about until after the Tunis Agenda, when various governments and the General Assembly decided to sort of rend asunder what the Tunis Agenda had put together. They had been. Enhanced cooperation is well situated inside the multi-stakeholder dialogue. The multi-stakeholder dialogue that was defined as the forum, the IGF being that forum. Now, what happened when they did that, they sort of orphaned enhanced cooperation. They took it out of its home, they took it out of its context, made it a thing standing on its own, a thing in itself. Shortly after the decision was made, you know, you found people going, what are we supposed to do with this enhanced cooperation? How are we supposed to do this? It became something without a context. And in many ways, it still remains without that context. We have a lot of people saying there has been a lot of enhanced cooperation, and indeed that's true. But then people can look at that and say, well, I don't think that was really enhanced cooperation, because I think enhanced cooperation requires a structure that does enhance cooperation. And that's because we took it out of its context. And so when I look about going forward, it's that enhanced cooperation has to come back to the context that was originally defined for it. It has to come back into the forum. The Internet Governance Forum. Now, when I say it has to come back to the forum, I'm not one of those that's saying we've been doing it already. We've been doing a few things that I think can be called acts of enhancing cooperation. But in a sense, we've never posited that here we are now doing enhanced cooperation. I think it's time for the IGF to basically claim it back and sort of say, you know, the IGF is an interesting organization because, not organization, but is an interesting phenomenon because, yes, it doesn't produce decisions, but it isn't just a talking shop. It is a place that has what I've been seeing as sort of soft notion of oversight. It comments, it makes suggestions, it has messages, it has all kinds of working together that basically others then look at it. The organizations that are responsible for actually doing things look at it and say, oh my word, we really need to do something here. I know that from within ICANN, I cannot count the number of times I've heard the IGF quoted as, you know, we really ought to fix this, because otherwise in next year's IGF, where they talked about us last year and they'll talk about us this year, and we won't have improved, and, you know, we got to do something. So the IGF has matured beyond what it was when it was formed. It has a certain self-assurance. It has a structure that continues to move forward. And so what I'm really suggesting is that the IGF is indeed the place to start talking about enhanced cooperation. There's all sorts of understanding to be done. There's all sorts of evaluations and comments to be made. And so when I look at the way of going forward, the best way of going forward is not to start something new. We start something new, we'll spend another 5 years figuring out who we are and how we work. We'll be going through everything we just went through all over again to figure out how to have multi-stakeholder dialogue, how to do things, as opposed to taking the IGF that obviously still needs to grow, still needs to improve, still needs to do lots of stuff that it isn't doing. So my suggestion is, and it's a suggestion we've already heard a couple times here, is that we sort of recognize the Tunis agenda's way it was written, that enhanced cooperation is a process that was put inside a forum. It is a process, yes, they didn't want to wait until the forum actually got started to talking about this process. So they're listed separately, but they're listed within the same context, with the same environment. And so my recommendation is that we bring it back, we acknowledge it as work we are doing, acknowledge it as work we are doing with the other organizations that already work very well with the IGF, and get a move on, and no longer treat it like the orphan that has no real home. Thank you.
Thank you, Avri. And I think I'm very happy that at the end you made a concrete proposal that means to turn the IGF into the place for discussing enhanced cooperation. If I remember correctly, you know, when we prepared the first IGF in 2006, in essence, there was a debate whether the discussion on enhanced cooperation and critical internet resources should be on the main agenda, yes or no. And there were some groups in the preparatory process which said, please not, because this will undermine the IGF, because we then enter rather quickly into a conflict and we lose the constructive approach. This has changed over the years. So, but Teresa was with ICANN at this time, now it's with the business community. Teresa, two questions. Do you see a change in the approach of the business community and technical community to discussing enhanced cooperation within the IGF? And what would be your very concrete proposal for the coming year?
Thank you. I actually see a change in dialogues among all constituency groups since 2005 and prior to 2005, actually. Not just around enhanced cooperation, but I think around issues such as critical net resources, around data protection, around a range of issues. And I think part of it is because we've seen an evolution over time. Perhaps the orphan is, if I can put that in the context, we're seeing an evolution of a better understanding and appreciation of views, but also of issues. And I think this goes to your EC3, if I can put it that way, the cooperation, coordination, and collaboration among different institutions, organizations, and stakeholders to appreciate and understand each other's views. So in 2005, I don't think we could have envisaged this kind of dialogue here at this IGF. In 2005, I think we were still looking at where to discuss critical internet resources and what that even meant. So taking that, I don't think that it's only the business community or the technical community, but I think it's all communities that have gotten a better understanding of the issues. A lot of this has been because we've had inclusive dialogues. I think that's really fundamentally important, and the IGF has been core to that. And as was flagged also this morning, we've seen a transformation and we've seen a lot of developments since the adoption of the Tunis Agenda, and examples of types of cooperation that we could never have foreseen before, whether it's UNESCO involved in multilingual language or whether it's other initiatives in other forums. So to get to the concrete proposals and moving on that, the ongoing activities that have helped us have been around openness, inclusiveness, and outreach, and that's been quite helpful. And we've also had stakeholders take advantage of forums and come to events like these, but come to other forums and other events in different parts of the world. So where do we need to go? Well, I think this morning we'd heard quite a bit about the need for mapping and assessment. And really, I think Erika Mann had raised that earlier, but I think it also came up in some of the other dialogues. What do we have a full strategic and operational understanding of what it is that all the different institutions do and who's responsible for what? So I think we need to understand that in a better way. We need to have an assessment of where are there gaps and how might one fill the existing gaps. And I think in looking at a mapping and assessment process, I think we also need to understand how we want to do that and where we want to do it. And to Aubrey's point, this has been an orphan that has been taken care of in different places, but perhaps it is time for it to have a home so we can get to the next phase of this dialogue and actually operationalize the process of discussing it much further. So I think with that, I would really actually like to engage with the audience and hear people's views of what should be included in a mapping exercise, what should be included in an assessment, what are some of the criteria. Are there a set of underlying principles that we should keep referring back to, a reaffirming of the Tunis Agenda, a re-acknowledgement that there were some very heavily negotiated points and agreements in that are a premise for this dialogue? So that would be my specific suggestion, but I really would like to hear from the audience as well.
Thank you, Teresa. I think these are very concrete proposals, mapping. Okay, yeah, thank you, Teresa. These are very concrete proposals, mapping and assessment, and I also, can only support that Teresa has invited the audience, to come with own proposals. We are collecting here proposals, and then, we will move forward on the basis of the proposals which come from you. This is a bottom-up process, but before I ask the audience to make their own proposals, I go through the list of speakers here, and next one is Bernadette from the Caribbean Telecommunication Union, and I think developing countries play now a much bigger role in all this internet governance discussions than in 2005, and how you see from your perspective what the next step should be.
All right, thank you, Wolfgang. Yes, indeed, and I have to agree with you, developing countries are playing a bigger role, and I want to speak from the perspective of what has happened in the Caribbean. They are playing a bigger role, and I think we have a fairly large Caribbean contingent at this particular IGF, because a lot has been invested in awareness building and education on the issues. Now, the Caribbean Telecommunication Union is primarily a policy organization, but we found it impossible to create policy because we could not just work with our governments. We needed to engage the widest cross-section of stakeholders, and we have really changed the face of the organization of the CTU in that we now have private sector, civil society membership. We have members of the academic fraternity, and that has really created a platform for engagement of multiple stakeholders. But more than that, we have had to have outreaches at many levels, at the level of the governments, at the level of the man on the street, at the level of the academic fraternity, multiple engagement of stakeholders. And this has been one of the reasons why you find there are more people understanding more about internet governance, and the organizations that cooperate and collaborate to make the internet work. We have found it necessary to have particular outreaches to our governments and also to ordinary citizens, because as an ICT organization you found that it was the ICT practitioners, the technical community participating. So special care had to be taken to ensure that you had the civil society represented, non-governmental organizations, the government institutions that are not directly concerned with the internet or with ICTs. And this has been a critical factor in terms of increasing awareness and engaging the stakeholders, getting greater participation in the business of the internet. However, I think one of the things that we have yet to do is help in mobilizing the non-traditional communities, and a certain amount of training in how do you get your views and your concerns at the level where they can get into the process. So there's a need for advocacy, and also the CTU serves as a facilitator. We don't necessarily do the work, but we facilitate the organizations who are charged with the responsibility to get their work done. So we would bring the stakeholders together, we will facilitate their meetings, we would facilitate the communication lines, and we introduce mechanisms that would assist them in doing their work. So if I had to leave and one final thing is that, as was mentioned this morning, there is no right solution, and that we have had to change our approaches at different times to enable us to achieve our goals. And so it is a case of understanding the state of the environment and adjusting your processes to match the situation. So public awareness, definitely at multiple levels, outreaches to multiple stakeholders, mobilizing the communities, helping them in advocacy, and facilitating the process. And I think those would be my interventions at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernadette. So our list gets longer, very concrete: outreach, education, to non-traditional groups. So because very often we try to speak to people who understand already the issues, but we have to speak also to people who have not yet been part of this discussion. So I think that's an important point, and we take this to the list. Paul, you coming from a different region, from the Asia-Pacific region. This was one of the first regional internet registries, and you manage as very concrete critical resource. This is the subject of discussion on enhanced cooperation. So that means, what is your approach to this?
Okay, thanks, Wolfgang. I'm from APNIC, and we're one of the long-standing members of the internet technical community, and as such we've always regarded ourselves as open, as an open organisation, open to anyone at all with an interest, and that's a foundation of the way we as an organisation, we as a member of the technical community have always operated. But I think we've seen increasingly over the years that openness in practice is not just a matter of having an open door. It's a matter of going out and seeing who else's door is open, and even knocking on a few doors to see what you can do to engage, to enhance communication and engagement, as Wolfgang mentioned before, as a means to actually increase the effectiveness of your openness in practice. And I think from the technical community we started off also, as Wolfgang said, with a very well-defined technical role, but steadily over the last 10, 15 years, I think I can speak for all of us in saying that we're learning more and more about this openness in practice and doing more and more all the time, while at the same time the demands around us and on us are also changing and increasing. So as Wolfgang said, it's a process, not an event or a goal that can be achieved. So at the level of the NRO is the organisation that represents the 5 regional internet registries. We answered some time ago the call for a regular report on enhanced cooperation in the form of a report that we called, quite deliberately, we called it continuing cooperation. The idea being to carry exactly that idea of an ongoing process. I don't see an end point, and I think the NRO does not see an end point in that process at all. That said, though, there are plenty of things underway and plenty of next steps for us and for all of us, depending on who you are. So there's a copy of this NRO Continuing Cooperation Report available to anyone who's interested. I think the next steps depend on who you are, and so I think enhanced cooperation is a good case of what's called subsidiarity, this principle that the best solution to a given problem is the solution to a given problem is best located as close to that problem as possible. It's the idea of distribution of responsibility, and so what's next for us in the technical community, in the NRO and the APNIC is not necessarily the same priority for others. At APNIC, as an example, we've got one new significant development coming up, which is the establishment of a Public Policy Advisory Committee, and that's a pretty big step for us in our region. We haven't had such a thing, although other RIRs have had their own form of a similar sort of process underway. We've got new projects coming up with in policy development with the ITUD in Bangkok, focused around IPv6 deployment, for instance. And that's just us, and that's just at the moment. So other RIRs and others have got other projects underway as well. I think the common thread across all of them is that enhanced cooperation is a means to actually increase and improve multi-stakeholderism. So as Avery said, it's clear enough in the Tunis agenda that enhanced cooperation is more or less secondary to the multi-stakeholder process, to the Internet Governance Forum, and I think that's a really good point to debate here or to recognise. And so for us on the MAG, I think we could, if there's a consensus and support for doing so, we could definitely consider that question for the next IGF. So apart from all the other things that we're doing towards enhanced communication, cooperation, collaboration, I think that's one good question, one good issue for this session here. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. And now we go to Latin America. Carolina, has the perspective from the south, from the other south, in South America. You are dealing very concrete with another resource, the domain names, in particular the country code top-level domains, which are operating under national legislation. They are part of the national sovereignty, and we have a paragraph in the Tunis agenda also which refers to the national domain name space. So from your perspective, how this should be handled in the coming year.
Thank you, Wolfgang. First of all, CCTLDs are very old internet communities in South America and Latin America in general. I mean, in most countries the internet was brought and then directly expanded through the CCTLD. So they're very savvy communities, and there we've got sort of an interesting granularity. But what has happened, and something I see which is a challenge for my work and for the ideas that we have in LACTLD to enhance capacity building in CCTLDs, is to make them understand the importance of internet governance. Many of them say we are engaged with urgent matters on a day-to-day business, but the urgent matters always overlap the important ones. So we try to develop an awareness on what value CCTLDs can gain from engaging more actively in such issues. for example, even if they're working in security of the registry security or policy regarding security for domain names, I mean, that has great implications for internet governance issues. And they just think that it's something down there, and we try to make them escalate those problems to at least to their national communities. And then there's a trick in the word of cooperation, because when you talk about cooperation, you're thinking of different stakeholders. And here I adhere very strongly with Paul's idea that multi-stakeholderism has to come first, and then cooperation. We need, in many Latin American countries, still to develop greater a greater diversity, a greater institutional thickness to the stakeholders involved in internet governance. Then we can move forward and think about cooperation. And I remember last year, Romulo Neves, he was at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs representing all these issues, and he asked me a very provocative question. I said, how many Latin American governments are participating in this forum in Nairobi last year? And actually there were this hand is, as much as Latin American governments were participating there. And so now I bring another issue. Governments in many developing areas have a very strong position. I think that one way to really work to promote enhanced cooperation is to make them aware that of their regulatory capacity, and that not always taking over critical internet resources or other public goods, by the way, is the best way to regulate. Maybe there are other more interesting ways to serve the public interest by engaging multi-stakeholderism into governance. So I think I'm stopping here, and then I'm open to questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I wanted to ask also some to representatives from the government, what is their proposal for change, and what I would ask them is how you are engaged in this. Just the question raised by Carolina, saying that we need the engagement of governments at an early stage of policy development in these internet communities. And insofar, I think it's a good point in the recent GAC communique from Toronto 2 weeks ago, that the governments agreed, to start in a collaborative way at an early stage in policy development processes within ICANN. I think this is mostly welcome. Governments should not wait until a policy is established and then to say yes or no to the policy. They should become part of this multi-stakeholder dialogue from the very early stage if it comes to policy development processes. And the second thing I would have asked the governments here is, one of the things which has to be changed is that governments really speak with one voice. Very often, in different organizations, also intergovernmental organizations, in one organization you have the Ministry of Economics, in the other you have the Foreign Ministry or the Ministry of Culture or Ministry of Technology, and all these representatives of one government have different positions. And we had this discussion in ICANN 2 weeks ago when the WHIS discussion was on the table, and Carlos referred to this morning when he said, okay, certainly the law enforcement people in a country have a different position to WHIS database than the data protection commissioners. So, and this has to be figured out. I think this is the homework governments have to do, to be prepared for this multi-stakeholder dialogue. I think this is a challenge. Unfortunately, Hessa and Alice is not here, so they have no chance to comment. Probably they will show up, but I think now it's time to open it to the audience, and I'm looking for your proposal. So far I have 7 points on my list, but I would be happy to get 3 or 5 more. So that means we have 2 microphones. Please go to the microphone, and whatever you want to say would be good. We have here already one speaker. Can you introduce yourself? Okay, Norbert. Yeah, now it works.
Am I online now?
Yeah.
Okay, my name is Norbert Bollo. I'm from the Swiss Open Systems User Group. And last year, at the last IGF, I organized a workshop on internet governance mapping. One of my personally big takeaways from that being that there's a great variety of perspective of interest on a map of internet governance. And from that perspective, I would say it's really important to have a plurality of people with different ways of thinking about it, working together on mapping things so that we do not get a map that just takes the input. We want issues, we want this, we want that, but actually reflects the variety of understanding of what the map should help with in order to have a map that represents the big diversity of reality that we have in this space. And I would add a concrete request or proposal for moving things forward, and that is to provide a way in which anyone, not just government, can make a legitimate proposal for discussion at the next IGF. I mean, India was criticized for having illegitimately introduced the proposal at the UN General Assembly. I'm not sure that that is not legitimate, but for civil society organization, we don't have that door open at all. So I would request, please provide a way for making proposals for discussion, and maybe people are interested and it will get discussed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And before I go to Bertrand, are there questions from the remote participation? May I ask the remote moderators whether there are questions from remote participation? If this is not the case, then I move to Bertrand.
Good afternoon. My name is Bertrand de la Chapelle. I am the head of a program called Internet and Jurisdiction and a member of the ICANN board. I want to make 2 points. The first one is going in the direction that was mentioned before, both by Teresa and Avery. The discussion has changed and evolved in the last 5-6 years in the IGF. People are now more comfortable with addressing thorny issues. And honesty requires to recognize that when the debate in the WSIS reached the end, there was one key issue, which is the role of the United States government in the management and the supervision of the root server files. It is an issue. There are a certain number of actors who are not satisfied with this. It is not an issue that will go away. Unfortunately, so far, it is very hard to imagine a system that is working better, but I would like to make this distinction that this is one issue. But enhanced cooperation is actually covering many other aspects that are much more operational and much more important to the daily life of the users. And here, the suggestion that I would like to make for the future discussions is not to talk about enhanced cooperation in the singular, but begin to talk about enhanced cooperations. What we're talking about is various modes of addressing issues. They can be extremely technical, they can be highly political, they can be very business-oriented. And the respective roles of the different stakeholders, that is an expression that, as you know, is contained in the definition of Internet governance. The respective roles of the stakeholders vary according to the issue, the stage of the discussion, and the kind of problem that you want to address, and even the venue where you discuss them. So I would like to introduce this element of using the plural and understanding that what is at stake is how to catalyze issue-based governance networks or issue-based cooperation networks that associate in an appropriate manner the relevant stakeholders on an issue-by-issue basis. And this is an important element to understand, because the solution is not to create or to try to create a digital security council, a single body that would cover all aspects. Honestly, even if it were fully multi-stakeholder, this is not the solution to create one single thing. Governance on internet matters should be distributed, and we need to help catalyze issue-based cooperation networks.
Thank you, Bertrand. And before I then ask the panelists to react to certain proposals, I would give the lady
I'll
the...
tell you my name when I finish.
Okay.
I don't want to lose my train of thought because I just want to follow through with Bertrand. Apart from issue-based, we should also look at level-based corporations. Over the 7 Internet Governance Fora that we've had, we've started having more national engagement, especially in developing countries. And where I live, we're actually beginning to impulse, to motivate even sectoral IGF, the Children Internet Governance Forum, the Women Internet Governance Forum, and the Youth Internet Governance Forum. So I'm also looking at corporations being enhanced at these kinds of levels and across countries, because there are some issues, as Bertrand has pointed out, that may not necessarily be global, but may concern island countries. So I'm also looking at enhanced cooperations between specific countries who have similar issues. I am from the Africa Internet Governance, specifically from the West African Internet Governance, and home from the Ivory Coast Internet Governance. My name is Nenna. Thank you.
Nana, thank you very much. I think it's a very, very useful proposal to go not only, issue by issue, but, also region by region, national by national. And as Markus Kummer always has argued, internet governance starts at home. And, this we should take into consideration. Next is Jeremy.
Avri, I appreciated very much your suggestion that the IGF should take on for itself the role of operationalizing enhanced cooperation as it's set out in the Tunis agenda, and I would applaud that. The only problem that I see is that time and again we've found the MAG and the CSTD alike stymied in this by maybe only a couple of people or a couple of stakeholders who are opposed to the enhanced cooperation process that would be inclusive of multi-stakeholders. And so how can we overcome this? It seems to me difficult to make any progress at all while both the MAG and the CSTD seem to operate on a basis of full consensus before going ahead.
Probably this can be changed. The MAG has no rules of procedure, and probably the next MAG meeting could start to work on rules of procedure which would allow a certain flexibility. You want to continue, or Alejandro?
Wolfgang, this is hello everybody. This is Radio IGF speaking to you. Wolfgang, I have some doubts, and I hope that you will be able to clarify about this mapping question. First, who is to perform this mapping? I mean, I perceive in your discourse, or in the discourse of this meeting, the idea that some central body is about to start doing a mapping of issues that are not properly addressed. And that scares me a bit because I think that this mapping happens all over the place, all the time, from the bottom up, or to use an even better geometrical figure, from the edge inwards. There was no mapping that said there would be fishing, no mapping that said that the anti-fishing working group would convene. Once fishing began to become a problem, people began to cooperate and work together, found the right combination of lawyers, engineers, government officials, and put together the anti-fishing working group. They found their own governance. It's working well. This is what Bertrand has recently now put his seal of approval on the issue and problem-solving approach, which we have been advocating in the internet community for long before even the WSIS was convened. So is it your idea that there's going to be a centralized effort of mapping? Or is it possible that many different academic groups will look at this, and also people who actually have problems will actually begin to build their own solutions?
I think it's always good to have skeptical voices so that you are not driven, by your own enthusiasm in a certain direction. So that means this is very welcome all. But you have to start. And you have to do something. And if you do sometimes, you are proactive and you can see a problem at an early stage. Sometimes you are taken just by a development. And your fishing example is a good example. I think this is a decentralized system. And, if a group starts and put it to the table, I think it's the similar process in the IETF. One identifies a problem, then he gets enough supporters and he brings it to a process, and at the end of the day, if you have all voices heard, then you can come to a certain result which remains open for further enhancement and further development. It's an ongoing process, and as I said in the beginning, this has a beginning but no end, so it will never end. We have more voices from the floor, and then, unfortunately, we have to finish this session, and I want to give all the speakers, a chance to react to some of the proposals.
Okay, thanks. My name is Jack. I'm in APC. I'm just responding to Bertrand and Nana's comment earlier. Whilst I think that it's really important to have different networks, and I think that's really interesting idea, like networks of issues and networks of stuff. But then, and I certainly don't believe in one forum to rule them all. But I also think that sometimes diffusion of spaces can also mean a lot of diffusion of resources, and we also need to really look at this as a potential kind of barrier for civil society engagement particularly, because that can be quite a big challenge. And also for the suggestion on levels, I think, net level, looking at it from a level or sectorial. So an IGF for women, an IGF for youth, an IGF for children. That freaks me out a little bit. I really think that's a bad idea, because I think that what will happen is you will start to ghettoize particular issues, and then, familiar hierarchies of issues will start to emerge again, and then you have like national security at the top, and then you have like women and children at the bottom, and that just does not work. And I think what needs to happen instead is you need to make sure that there's a lot of different kinds of expertise and perspectives and analysis that really grounds, for example, issues of security with also a dimension of security for women. What does this mean? Security for LGBT. What does this mean? Security for children. What does this mean? As opposed to just looking at security from like, a national security kind of perspective. But saying that, I think looking at it from a national level and trying to make sure that discussions around EC and multi-stakeholder also tries to engage really at a very genuine thinking through and creatively, like how do we create models and processes in which there are many different stakeholders that can come in from national level itself with the national IGFs that's taking place, and then building that forward from regional to what we're having today.
Thank you, Jack. Very useful comments. Go ahead.
Hello. Thank you. Mawaki from APC. So it seems like we are heading toward the consensus that enhanced cooperation is not about, or is not even around governments specifically. And I would like to have your answer on that question. And if that's so, following the proposal earlier on to organize the cooperation around issues and levels, I would like to suggest that inside civil society itself, can we imagine mechanisms and ways? For example, Bernadette talked about the need for a capacity building and advocacy, etc., in some of the region. Can we imagine mechanisms where inside civil society we can practice enhanced cooperation, where we might have the opportunity to move resources in terms of knowledge, expertise, etc., from points of concentration where they are to some point where they are critically needed in order to advance issues of internet governance on the ground. Thank you.
So thank you. I have now closed the list of... Bertrand, you have the last word, like always.
No, I just wanted to complement a little bit what Alejandro was saying. The danger is to make an academic exercise about the mapping. This is not what we're talking about. He's absolutely right. The IGF in the last 6 years has produced a wonderful agenda setting and agenda filtering. When an issue emerges, the mapping that has to be done is who is doing something in that topic to make sure that at the next IGF at least, all those actors are gathered a little bit more. And I hope that the MAG will take that into account in structuring the program for next year and organize it more around aggregating workshops and not only the bottom-up proposals. They are very important, but calling for themes and aggregation to identify all the actors around the theme is probably a good way forward.
Okay, thank you, Bertrand. This was not the last word. The last word is for the ladies. And so I start now with Camilla. Can you just reflect about what we have heard in the last minutes also from the floor?
I remember last year during the last I remember last year in the last session taking stock on the way forward. I think it was Janet, you were moderating or saying something, taking a lot about how has the IGF contributed and quantifying the impact of the IGF in different into the internet governance themes and topics. So I think there's many forms of mapping and of seeing who is taking an interest in what, and I really take this as an opportunity to thank you and see how from MAG we can work in developing a more consolidated agenda around certain issues and letting the particular interest groups and differences emerge, but I think we really need to rethink a lot of issues after this session. I recognize many faces from MAG here, and I take your input as interesting. And thank you.
Thank you, Carolina, and I apologize for mixing up your name. So, Paul.
Next.
Yeah.
In response to the question from our colleague from APC, I would say enhanced cooperation is certainly not all about governments. As a technical community member, I'll say here that enhanced cooperation is all about the technical community. But that's just my perspective. Subsidiarity again. There was one other point I wanted to make, which was in response to Bertrand. In the renewal of the IANA contract, the IANA arrangements, which has been undertaken a couple of times with public consultation processes, the NRO has recognised positively the move of the ICANN arrangements from the MOU with the Department of Commerce to Joint Progress Project Agreement to the affirmation of commitments, and now the ATRT accountability and transparency process and the recommendations. And we've welcomed those things, supported, appreciated those developments. They seem to be a good example of an enhanced cooperation involving more stakeholders who are engaged through those processes in various ways, becoming responsible in some way for the evolution of ICANN. So we've gone a little bit further than that and asked actually that the IANA arrangements should go through a similar staged process towards independence from any individual government. That's in public statements that the NRO has made, and we think I think I can speak for everyone to say that just to begin that process would be a very powerful next step towards enhanced cooperation. Thanks.
This would be really a step in the right direction, also into new territory. So let's wait and see what we will see on the table in a couple of years. Bernadette.
I'd just like to respond to something that you raised, Wolfgang, with respect to, in many governments, you may find that the responsibility for ICT and ICT matters, the internet and so on, may be spread over 4 or 5 ministries. We've seen it. It is a significant challenge. What we have found useful is the formulation of inter-ministerial committees that would address these issues. That has been worked quite well. It's just now to convince the rest of the governments to adopt that sort of approach. And I just want to go back to the need for communicating the message in language that is understood. You cannot speak technical things, the details to the ministers. I think this has come out on many different fora, but the language is important for engaging people at the level where they could participate in the process. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa.
Thank you. I have to say this discussion has been most interesting in part because it's flagged some new topics that hadn't even been flagged this morning and before. So I think what it does highlight is that the dialogue is important, including on how to move forward. Even the examples around a mapping assessment or exercise, hearing different views of what that should capture. We'd heard this morning, perhaps, that one looks at institutions and their roles and responsibilities, where there may be gaps and how those could be improved. But then in our dialogue this afternoon, we also heard the enhanced cooperations, and I think that's a very important point. How does one actually factor that into how to move forward in a way that is realistic and inclusive and can move the ball forward from a theoretical discussion to a concrete improvements area? And we heard different country levels and other levels, women and youth and civil society and those kinds of dialogues. So I think we don't have all the answers, but I think we're starting to have a list of things that would be very useful also for the MAG to take into consideration in its preparations of next year's IGF. And that's a very good thing to highlight as a mechanism of improving also the IGF process and factoring in these points. So we'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Teresa and Avi now.
Thank you. I guess a couple of things. One, in terms of enhanced cooperation being many things. I think, yes, I tend to think of enhanced cooperation as a set of things where there are many forms, there's many organizations, there's many subsidiarities. They all need enhancement. I look at the IGF, and one of the problems with calling it the IGF all the time is that we forget that the F stands for a forum. The F stands for a place where there are many groupings. They form, they change, they build ad hoc on interests. So any of these, and I definitely agree with avoiding the dispersion. One of the things I think I want to avoid more than anything is the dispersion into many different little corners where we only have a certain people that work on something. That's what the forum allows us to escape. We all come here, we gather at one point on this topic in that grouping, at another point on another topic in that grouping. Finally, to Jeremy, who has been one of those who has thought for a long time that we had to read enhanced cooperation as coming after 67 and before 72, and that it was something that we were supposed to do. It's something we have to persist on. It's something that we have to keep bringing up. It's something that we have to keep going to our MAG members and saying, hey, this is something you really... And one of the things, the last thing I'll say, having spent 5 years at a point on the IGF Secretariat, the IGF Secretariat and others doing stuff could never write about something that you all hadn't already brought to the table, that you all hadn't already committed the first act of putting that thought out there. So if this is something we really are supposed to do, it's up to us to keep putting it on the table, and once it's on the table, it needs to be discussed, and we keep working at it, and I think we will have the point where we are talking about it. It's not that we become the forum of enhanced cooperation, it becomes yet another one of the things we do. Thanks.
Thank you, Avi. I think this was an exciting dialogue, although we had a lot of interventions. And here are as a final statement, my 12 messages from this session to the IGF. I think the first message is the Internet Governance Forum is the home for enhanced discussion of enhanced cooperation. Second message is we have to do a mapping, avoiding the occupation by some group of this mapping process that should be a very diverse and open process. We need to have an assessment of what has been done and a critical evaluation, a review or whatever of existing processes. We have to have capacity building. This is number 4. Capacity building, although to outreach to people who are not traditional customers of these meetings. We have to do more education and advocacy. This is number 5. Number 6 is we have to distribute responsibilities on the principle of subsidiarity. Number 7 is we have to have more engagement on the local level within the national frameworks. Number 8 is we have to have more pluralism and diversity to move from enhanced communication to enhanced communications with an S. Number 9 is we need mechanisms where the various stakeholders can launch proposals for consideration. Not only for governments in the United Nations system, but also for private sector members, technical community, civil society, to have a procedure where they can make a proposal, then open for discussion, taking into consideration the experience the IETF has with the RFCs. Number 10 is, we have to go issue by issue, level by level, but we should avoid ghettos and we should avoid silos. Number 11 is, we should invite governments to establish interministerial committees so that they bring their own house in order and come with a consolidated position to the various meetings of intergovernmental organizations. And number 12 is we have to improve the mechanism of the MAC. The MAC could become really a much more important body where via the MAC you can channel a lot of these concrete messages which come out from the IGF into various processes. This is uncharted territory. We're moving into new procedures, new forms of collaboration among all stakeholders, and if enhanced cooperation will achieve this, then we are one step further probably in the year 2013. I thank all the panelists and I thank the audience. And now we have a short coffee break and we will continue with the final session chaired by Markus Kummer. Thank you.